Homeless man shares bread with Elon Musk. What he does next is unbelievable. The bustling streets of downtown were alive with the usual chaos of city life. Cars honked impatiently, pedestrians weaved through the crowds, and street vendors called out their daily specials. Amid the cacophony, a man in a rumpled jacket sat cross-legged on the cold concrete, his belongings tucked into a worn backpack beside him. His face was weathered, his beard unkempt, but his eyes held a quiet dignity that belied his circumstances. This was Frank, a man who had seen better days but refused to let the world take his humanity. Frank unfolded a crumpled napkin, revealing a small loaf of bread, his meal for the day. He broke off a piece carefully, savoring the simplicity of it. As he ate, the occasional passerby threw him a glance, some with pity, others with indifference. Frank didn't mind, he was used to being invisible. At that moment, a man in a sleek black jacket stepped out of a nearby cafe, clutching a to-go cup of coffee. His presence immediately drew attention, not because he sought it, but because of who he was. Elon Musk, the billionaire visionary, was unmistakable even in casual attire. His pace was brisk, but his gaze was observant, scanning the streets as if taking in every detail. Frank noticed him, though it took a moment for recognition to settle in. "Must be nice," he muttered under his breath, eyeing Elon's polished shoes. He wasn't bitter, just realistic. In Frank's world, billionaires and homeless men didn't interact. But then, something surprising happened. As Elon walked past, his gaze lingered on Frank. He paused, hesitating for just a moment before turning back. "Good afternoon," Elon said, his voice friendly but understated. Frank looked up, startled. He hadn't expected anyone, let alone a man like Elon Musk, to acknowledge him. "Afternoon," he replied cautiously, his voice gruff. Elon crouched slightly to meet Frank's eye level, his expression curious. "That bread any good?" he asked, nodding toward the loaf. Frank blinked, unsure if he was being mocked. "It's bread," he said, shrugging. "It does the job." A small smile tugged at Elon's lips. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" Frank raised an eyebrow, scanning Elon as if trying to discern his motives. "It's a free sidewalk," he said finally, gesturing to the spot beside him. To Frank's astonishment, Elon lowered himself onto the pavement, sitting cross-legged just like him. The billionaire looked entirely out of place among the grimy streets, but he seemed unfazed. For a moment, they sat in silence, the din of the city swirling around them. Frank couldn't help but laugh, a dry, incredulous sound. "You're not exactly dressed for this," he said, nodding toward Elon's jacket. Elon chuckled. "Probably not," he admitted. "But sometimes, it's good to see things from a different angle." Frank shook his head, still skeptical. "All right, so what's the angle here? You doing some kind of PR stunt?" Elon's expression grew serious. "No," he said simply. "I just saw someone eating bread alone and figured I'd say hello." Frank studied him for a moment, then reached into his napkin and tore off a piece of bread. "Here," he said, holding it out. "If you're gonna sit here, might as well share." Elon accepted the bread without hesitation, taking a bite as if it were a delicacy. "Not bad," he said, chewing thoughtfully. "Simple but good." Frank watched him, still trying to make sense of the situation. "You're a strange one," he said finally. "Probably," Elon agreed, smiling faintly. As they sat there, an older man in a suit passed by, glancing at them with a mixture of confusion and disdain. "What's the world coming to?" The man muttered loudly, shaking his head. Frank bristled, but Elon remained calm, his focus unwavering. "Don't mind him," Elon said, his tone reassuring. "Some people can't see past their own assumptions." Frank nodded slowly, still wary but beginning to relax. "You get that a lot?" he asked. Elon shrugged. "People think they know everything about you when they've only seen a headline." Frank smirked. "Well, you're not exactly low profile." "Fair point," Elon conceded. "But there's more to people than what you see on the surface." Frank fell silent, his thoughts swirling. He wasn't sure what to make of this man who spoke so plainly yet carried the weight of unimaginable wealth and power. Part of him wanted to push Elon away, to cling to his distrust. But another part, a quieter, more hopeful part, was curious. Their conversation was interrupted by a voice from behind. "Hey, you can't sit here." The shout came from a stocky man in a cafe uniform, his face flushed with irritation. "This isn't a hangout spot." Elon stood slowly, his expression calm but firm. "We're not causing any trouble," he said. The man crossed his arms, glaring at Frank. "This guy's been loitering here for weeks. We've told him to move on." Frank clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said through gritted teeth. The man ignored him, addressing Elon instead. "You don't want to associate with people like him." Elon's gaze hardened, a flicker of anger flashing in his eyes. "People like him?" he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. The man faltered, realizing too late that he had overstepped. "I just mean, he's not your kind of crowd." Elon stepped closer, his tone icy but controlled. "Do you think you're better than him because you work in a cafe?" The man stammered, his bravado crumbling under Elon's intensity. I didn't mean anything by it." Frank stood, his shoulders squared. "Don't waste your breath," he muttered. "People like him never listen." But Elon wasn't finished. "Everyone deserves respect," he said firmly. "And if you can't see that, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." The man glared at Frank one last time before retreating into the cafe, his pride wounded. Frank exhaled, his tension easing slightly. "You didn't have to do that," he said to Elon. "I know," Elon replied, "but I wanted to." For the first time, Frank allowed himself to smile. A small, fleeting gesture, but genuine. "Thanks," he said quietly. Elon nodded, his expression softening. "It's the least I could do." The two men sat back down, the bread between them a symbol of a connection neither had expected. And though the city continued to bustle around them, in that moment, it felt as if the world had paused, just for a little while. The uneasy calm of the moment between Frank and Elon was soon interrupted by a small crowd gathering near the cafe's outdoor seating area. People walking by had begun to notice Elon, not because of who he was, but because of the juxtaposition, the billionaire sitting casually on the sidewalk with a homeless man, sharing a piece of bread. Whispers traveled through the gathering group, their gazes flickering between the unlikely pair. "What's he doing sitting there?" one woman muttered to her companion, clutching a designer purse. "Is he making a statement or something?" Frank noticed the growing attention and instinctively hunched his shoulders, trying to make himself smaller. He wasn't used to being the center of attention unless it was from security guards or passers-by throwing him scornful glances. This was different, more scrutinizing, more judgmental. "Looks like you've got an audience," Frank said quietly, glancing at Elon. Elon, however, didn't seem fazed. "Let them watch," he said simply, his tone calm but firm. Among the onlookers was a man in a crisp business suit, his hair perfectly combed back, holding a steaming cup of coffee. He stepped forward with a smirk plastered across his face. "Well, this is a sight you don't see every day," the man said loudly, addressing the crowd more than anyone in particular. "A guy who looks like he walked off the cover of GQ sitting with someone who, well, hasn't." The comment drew a ripple of laughter from the crowd, and Frank's face flushed red. He looked down at his hands, his pride stung by the cruel remark. Elon glanced at the man, his expression unreadable, but he didn't respond. Instead, he remained seated, calm and steady. The man wasn't finished. "What's the deal here, huh? Social experiment? Charity photo op?" He sipped his coffee, his smirk widening. "Or is it just one of those days where you feel like slumming it?" Frank's fists clenched, his knuckles whitening. He was used to insults, but something about the man's smug tone cut deeper than usual. "Why don't you mind your own business?" Frank muttered under his breath. The man pretended not to hear, leaning forward slightly. "What was that?" Frank looked up, meeting the man's gaze. "I said, mind your own business." The crowd fell silent, the tension thick in the air. For a moment, it seemed as though the man might back down. But then he chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got a lot of nerve," he said. "Sitting there." Eating bread someone probably handed you, acting like you're entitled to something. Elon finally spoke, his tone measured but with an edge of steel. He offered me the bread, actually. The man blinked, caught off guard. What? He offered me his bread, Elon repeated. Didn't ask for anything in return, just shared what he had. The smirk on the man's face faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, brushing it off with a scoff. Well, isn't that touching, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But that doesn't change the fact that he's sitting here, freeloading. Frank stood abruptly, his voice rising despite the lump in his throat. You don't know anything about me, he said, his voice shaking with anger. You think because I'm out here I'm some kind of burden? Like I don't matter? The man's smirk returned, more condescending than before. Do you? The question hung in the air like a slap to the face. Frank's breath hitched, his mind racing for a response. But before he could speak, Elon stood as well, his towering presence commanding attention. Does he matter? Elon repeated, his voice sharp and deliberate. He stepped closer to the man, his eyes locked onto his. That's the question, isn't it? The man faltered, the confidence in his smirk wavering. I didn't mean, because if you're standing here, sipping your expensive coffee, looking down on him and asking if he matters. Elon continued, his voice unwavering, what does that say about you? The man opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. The crowd, once amused and judgmental, was now silent, their eyes shifting uncomfortably. Some even began to back away, the weight of the moment too much to bear. Frank stared at Elon, his anger giving way to something he hadn't felt in a long time: gratitude. He had never expected someone to stand up for him, let alone someone like Elon Musk. But even as relief washed over him, a pang of worry gnawed at his gut. You don't have to do this, Frank muttered, his voice low enough for only Elon to hear. Elon glanced at him, his expression softening. Yes, I do, he said simply. The tension broke as the man in the suit scoffed loudly, turning on his heel. This is ridiculous, he muttered, walking away and disappearing into the crowd. The crowd itself began to disperse, murmuring quietly among themselves. Some seemed ashamed, others merely curious. Frank and Elon were left alone once more, the echoes of the confrontation fading into the background noise of the city. Frank sank back onto the pavement, his body heavy with exhaustion. That guy's not wrong, he said, his voice bitter. I am a burden. Can't get a job. Can't keep a roof over my head. What's the point? Elon crouched beside him, his tone quiet but firm. You're not a burden, he said. You're just stuck. Frank laughed bitterly. Stuck, he repeated. Yeah, that's one way to put it. Elon reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times before holding it up to his ear. Hey, it's me, he said after a moment. I need you to look into something for me. There's someone here who could use a hand. Frank stared at him, his eyes wide. What are you doing? Elon held up a finger, gesturing for him to wait. I'll explain in a minute, he said, before turning his attention back to the phone. Thanks. I'll call you back soon. As he ended the call, Frank shook his head. What was that about? Elon smiled faintly. Just taking the first step, he said cryptically. Frank frowned, his skepticism returning. What does that mean? Elon stood, offering Frank a hand. It means you're not stuck anymore, he said. At least not if you don't want to be. Frank hesitated, staring at the outstretched hand. For a moment, he considered refusing, retreating back into the safety of his cynicism. But something in Elon's eyes, something steady, something real, made him reconsider. Slowly, Frank reached out, his fingers brushing against Elon's. And as he let himself be pulled to his feet, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, the faintest flicker of hope. Frank stood on shaky legs, his body stiff from hours of sitting on the cold pavement. Elon's steady hand didn't waver as he helped him up, but Frank's expression was a mix of confusion and mistrust. The moments after the confrontation had left him feeling unmoored. Was this man genuinely here to help? Or was he just playing the role of the benevolent savior for reasons Frank couldn't quite grasp? "All right," Frank said cautiously, brushing off his jacket. "You've got my attention. What's the catch?" "There's no catch," Elon replied calmly, sliding his phone back into his jacket pocket. "I just believe in helping people when I can." Frank scoffed, stepping back slightly. "You believe in helping people? A billionaire who probably steps over people like me on his way to work every day. Forgive me if I don't buy it." Elon raised an eyebrow but didn't lose his composure. "I don't expect you to trust me right away," he said, "but give me a chance." Before Frank could respond, a voice rang out from behind them. "Frank, what are you doing?" A woman in her mid-30s emerged from the shadows of a nearby alley, her face a blend of concern and irritation. She was bundled in layers of mismatched clothing, her wiry frame a testament to the hardships she had endured. Frank sighed, his shoulders slumping. "What does it look like, Carol?" "I'm talking." Carol's gaze shifted to Elon, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. "Who's this? Some reporter looking for a sob story?" "No," Elon interjected before Frank could answer. "Just someone who stopped to say hello." Carol crossed her arms, clearly unimpressed. "Yeah, right. People like you don't just say hello. What do you want?" Frank winced, but Elon remained unfazed. "Nothing," he said simply. "I just wanted to share a moment of kindness." Carol snorted, clearly unconvinced. "Kindness? From a guy in a leather jacket who probably spends more on coffee than we do on food in a month?" Elon smiled faintly but didn't argue. "You're right. I probably do. But that doesn't mean I don't care." Frank stepped in, his tone defensive. "Carol, just let it go, all right? He hasn't done anything wrong." "Yet," Carol muttered, her arms still crossed. "You've got to be careful, Frank. People like him don't just show up for no reason." Elon took a step closer, his expression softening. "I understand your skepticism," he said, addressing Carol directly. "But sometimes, people surprise you." Carol studied him for a moment before shaking her head. "Whatever. Just don't say I didn't warn you." She walked away, retreating to her usual corner a few yards down the street. Frank watched her go, a pang of guilt tugging at him. He didn't blame Carol for being suspicious. Life had taught them both to expect the worst, but something about Elon's presence felt different, even if Frank couldn't quite put his finger on it. "Don't mind her," Frank said, turning back to Elon. "She's just protective." "I understand," Elon replied. "It's not easy to trust strangers, especially when you've been let down before." Frank nodded, his expression somber. "Yeah, well, trust doesn't come cheap around here." For a moment, they stood in silence, the noise of the city filling the space between them. Then, without warning, a figure emerged from the cafe, the same man who had confronted them earlier. This time, he wasn't alone. Two other men, both wearing similar uniforms, flanked him, their expressions hard and unfriendly. "There he is," the first man said, pointing at Frank. "The guy who's been loitering outside our cafe for weeks." Frank tensed, his hands balling into fists. "I'm not loitering," he said through gritted teeth. "I'm just sitting on our property," one of the other men shot back. "We've told you before. Find somewhere else to go." Elon stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "He's not hurting anyone," he said. "Why does it matter where he sits?" The men exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by Elon's assertiveness. "Because it's bad for business," the first man said. "People don't want to see this when they're trying to enjoy their coffee." "This?" Elon repeated, his tone sharpening. "You mean a human being?" Frank's face flushed, a mix of anger and humiliation burning in his chest. He wanted to speak up, to defend himself, but the weight of the situation left him frozen. The first man crossed his arms, his confidence wavering but not entirely gone. "Look, we don't make the rules. We just enforce them." "Then maybe the rules need to change," Elon said, his voice steady but cutting. "Because if your business can't handle the sight of compassion, maybe it's not as successful as you think." The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken challenges. The men hesitated, clearly unsure of how to respond. Finally, one of them muttered something under his breath and turned away, motioning for the others to follow. "This isn't worth it," he said. "Let's go." As they retreated, Frank exhaled a shaky breath, his hands still clenched at his sides. "Why'd you do that?" he asked, his voice low. "You didn't have to." Elon turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Because it was the right thing to do." Frank shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "The right thing? People like you don't usually care about the right thing." "Maybe you've been around the wrong people," Elon replied, his tone softening. Frank stared at him, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and doubt. He wanted to believe Elon's words, but years of hardship had taught him that hope was dangerous, a luxury he couldn't afford. "Let's just call it even," Frank said finally, his voice tinged with resignation. "You stood up for me. Thanks. But I don't need your pity." "It's not pity," Elon said firmly. "It's respect." Frank's eyes widened slightly, caught off guard by the sincerity in Elon's voice. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he turned away, retreating to his usual corner near the alley. Elon watched him go, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city streets, Frank sat alone once more, the events of the day replaying in his mind. He didn't understand Elon's motives, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of something he had long thought lost: dignity. As the evening air grew cooler, Frank remained slouched against the cold brick wall, his arms wrapped around himself for warmth. Across the street, the world moved on, indifferent as ever. Office workers hurried to catch buses, couples strolled past laughing, and car horns blared from the intersection. Frank sighed, the earlier interaction with Elon already beginning to feel like some strange fever dream. Men like Elon Musk didn't just sit on sidewalks and share bread. It didn't make sense. Frank's ruminations were interrupted by the sharp creak of the cafe door swinging open. The manager, the man in the suit who had antagonized him earlier, stepped out once again, this time holding a clipboard in one hand and a pen in the other. He scanned the sidewalk, his lips curled into a thin, displeased line when his eyes landed on Frank. "Still here? Huh?" the manager said, his tone dripping with disdain. "You'd think you'd take a hint." Frank didn't look up. He had heard it all before. The insults, the veiled threats, they didn't even sting anymore. They just rolled over him like waves on a rock, eroding but never breaking. "You deaf or just ignorant?" the manager pressed, stepping closer. "This is private property. You can't just sit here all day, making my cafe look bad." Frank muttered without raising his head. "I'm not on your property. I'm on the public sidewalk." The manager smirked, a look of triumph flashing in his eyes. "Not for long, you're not." He held up the clipboard, tapping it with his pen. "See this? It's a petition. Already got signatures from half the businesses on this block. Once the city gets this, they'll clear out this whole area. No more loitering, no more distractions." Frank felt a pang of anger and helplessness rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Where am I supposed to go?" he asked quietly. The manager shrugged. "Not my problem. Maybe you should have thought about that before deciding to be a burden on society." Frank clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He was about to retort when a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Burden?" Elon's tone was calm, but the edge was unmistakable as he stepped out of the cafe behind the manager. His presence seemed to fill the small space, and the manager froze, his smirk faltering. "Mr. Musk," the manager stammered, clearly flustered. I didn't see you there." "I noticed," Elon said, his expression unreadable. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation." The manager straightened his posture, trying to regain his composure. "Just doing my job, sir. This man," he gestured to Frank, "has been loitering here for weeks. It's bad for business." Elon raised an eyebrow. "Bad for business, you say?" "Exactly," the manager said, nodding enthusiastically. "Customers don't want to see this when they come in for coffee." It ruins the atmosphere. For a moment, Elon didn't respond. He simply studied the manager, his gaze unwavering. The silence grew heavy, and the manager began to fidget under the scrutiny. Finally, Elon spoke, his voice measured but firm. "And you think the solution is to treat people like they're less than human?" The manager's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He was visibly flustered, his earlier confidence crumbling. "It's not. I didn't..." Elon didn't let him finish. "Do you know anything about this man?" he asked, nodding toward Frank. The manager hesitated, clearly unsure how to answer. "I know he's always here," he said finally. "Begging, taking up space." Frank winced at the words, but Elon didn't break his gaze from the manager. "Have you ever spoken to him?" he pressed. "Asked him why he's here? Or what he's been through?" The manager shifted uncomfortably, his bravado replaced by an awkward defensiveness. "That's not my job." "Then what is your job?" Elon asked sharply. "To make coffee? Or to treat people with decency?" The crowd from earlier had mostly dispersed, but a few stragglers lingered nearby, their eyes flickering between Elon, Frank, and the manager. The tension was palpable, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. The manager took a step back, his voice dropping to a defensive mutter. "I'm just trying to run a business, and I'm just trying to remind you that running a business doesn't mean you get to forget your humanity," Elon said, his tone softening slightly. "You think Frank is a burden? He's not. He's a person. And if you took 5 minutes to talk to him, you might actually learn something." The manager didn't respond. He looked away, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. Without another word, he turned on his heel and marched back into the cafe, the door slamming shut behind him. Frank let out a shaky breath, his emotions a whirlwind of gratitude, anger, and disbelief. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I did," Elon replied simply. He turned to Frank, his gaze steady. "But I didn't do it for you. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Frank nodded slowly, his throat tight. He didn't know how to respond, so he didn't. Instead, he sat back down on the sidewalk, his thoughts racing. Elon crouched beside him, his expression softening. "Do you want to get out of here?" he asked gently. Frank blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What?" "You heard me," Elon said. "Do you want to get out of here? Start fresh?" Frank hesitated, the weight of his doubts and fears pressing down on him. He had spent so long surviving that the idea of something better felt almost impossible. But as he looked at Elon, he saw something he hadn't seen in years, a genuine offer of hope. "I don't know," Frank admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wouldn't even know where to start." Elon smiled faintly. "That's okay," he said. "We'll figure it out together." Frank stared at him, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider the possibility of something more. And as the city lights flickered to life around them, he felt a small, fragile spark of hope begin to take root. As the night deepened, the streets grew quieter. The occasional headlights of passing cars cut through the darkness, but the hustle of the day had faded. Frank sat silently, the weight of Elon's offer pressing heavily on his mind. He couldn't shake the sense of disbelief. Why would someone like Elon Musk, someone who clearly had no reason to care, offer to help him? Frank had been abandoned by the system, ignored by passersby, and ridiculed by business owners like the cafe manager. This was the way of the world, wasn't it? People like him were forgotten. Elon remained by Frank's side, sitting cross-legged on the sidewalk as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He didn't say anything, didn't push Frank for a decision. Instead, he seemed content to simply be there, a silent presence offering an unfamiliar kind of support. The sound of footsteps echoed down the street, breaking the quiet. Frank looked up to see Carol returning, her arms laden with a mismatched collection of items. Plastic bags filled with canned goods, a worn blanket slung over one shoulder. Her expression darkened when she saw Elon still sitting there. "Still here?" she asked sharply, her gaze flicking between Elon and Frank. "What's this guy's deal?" Frank shrugged, unsure of how to respond. He's different, Carol scoffed, dropping her bags unceremoniously on the ground. Different? Please, they're all the same. Show up for 5 minutes, act like they care, then disappear as soon as it gets inconvenient. Elon looked up at her, his expression calm but serious. Sometimes people surprise you. Carol rolled her eyes. Yeah, sure. And sometimes pigs fly. Frank winced, but Elon didn't seem fazed. Instead, he turned to Carol and said, "What about you? What keeps you going?" Carol blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What?" "You heard me," Elon said. "What keeps you going? What gives you hope?" Carol stared at him, her expression hardening. "Hope? I gave up on hope a long time ago." Elon nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. "That's a shame," he said quietly, "because hope is what changes things." Carol snorted, crossing her arms. "Spare me the motivational speech, okay? We've heard it all before. Hope doesn't pay for food. It doesn't keep us warm. It doesn't get us off these streets." "No," Elon agreed, "but it's the first step." Carol opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the cafe door swung open again. This time, the manager didn't step out alone. He was flanked by 2 uniformed police officers, their expressions grim. Frank's stomach dropped. "Oh no," he muttered under his breath. The officers approached, their hands resting on their belts. "We've received complaints about loitering in this area," one of them said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You're going to have to move along." Frank felt his chest tighten. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he protested, his voice shaky. "I'm just sitting here." "On private property," the manager interjected smugly. "I've been more than patient, but enough is enough." "It's not private property," Frank shot back, his frustration boiling over. "It's a public sidewalk." The officers exchanged a glance, clearly not eager to escalate the situation. "Look, we don't want any trouble," one of them said, "but we can't have people loitering here. It's causing problems for the local businesses." Frank opened his mouth to argue further, but Elon stood up, his presence commanding immediate attention. "If anyone's causing problems," he said, his voice low and steady, "it's not him." The officers hesitated, clearly recognizing Elon but unsure of how to proceed. The manager, however, was undeterred. "With all due respect, Mr. Musk, this doesn't concern you." Elon turned to him, his expression sharp. "It concerns me when someone abuses their power to bully others." The manager's face flushed, his bravado faltering. "I'm just trying to run my business, and I'm trying to remind you what it means to be a decent human being." Elon shot back. "This man has just as much right to exist as you do." The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught in an awkward position. Frank watched the scene unfold, his emotions a whirlwind of gratitude, anger, and helplessness. He wanted to speak up, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, one of the officers cleared his throat. "Mr. Musk," he said cautiously, "we appreciate what you're trying to do, but we still have to enforce the rules." "Then enforce them fairly," Elon replied. "Because if you're going to move him along, you'd better move me along too." The officers exchanged another glance, clearly unsure of how to respond. The manager, meanwhile, looked like he was about to explode. "This is ridiculous," the manager snapped. "You're just enabling them. People like him don't want help. They just want handouts." Frank flinched at the words, his fists clenching at his sides. But before he could react, Elon stepped closer to the manager, his gaze unwavering. "People like him," Elon said, his voice dangerously quiet, "are stronger than you'll ever know. And if you had half the courage he does, you'd be a better man for it." The manager opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He turned on his heel and stormed back into the cafe, slamming the door behind him. The officers lingered for a moment before nodding politely and walking away, clearly unwilling to escalate the situation further. Frank let out a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping with relief. "Why did you do that?" he asked Elon, his voice barely above a whisper. Because it was the right thing to do, Elon replied simply. Frank stared at him, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. For the first time in years, he felt something he had long thought lost: dignity. As the night wore on, Frank found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, things could change after all. The streetlights cast a pale glow over the sidewalk as Frank shifted uncomfortably in his spot. The tension from the earlier confrontation lingered in the air, thick and oppressive. Frank couldn't believe Elon Musk had just stood up for him like that. But even as he tried to process what had happened, doubt gnawed at him. Surely, this man had somewhere better to be, something more important to do. Why was he still here? Elon, however, showed no sign of leaving. He leaned casually against the wall, his hands in his pockets, watching the street as though he had all the time in the world. Frank finally broke the silence. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice low. Elon turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "What do you mean?" "You've got everything," Frank said, gesturing vaguely. "Money, power, influence. Why waste your time on someone like me?" Elon studied him for a moment before answering. "Because I've been where you are." Frank blinked, startled. "What?" "Not in the exact same way," Elon admitted, his tone calm and measured. "But I've had my share of struggles. I faced failure, rejection, people telling me I wasn't good enough. I know what it's like to feel like the world is against you." Frank frowned, unsure how to respond. The idea of someone like Elon Musk, one of the richest men in the world, facing anything remotely similar to what he had gone through seemed impossible. "I don't buy it," he said finally. Elon smiled faintly, as though he had expected that reaction. "It's true," he said. "When I was starting out, there were days I didn't know if I'd make it. Times when I thought maybe everyone else was right. Maybe I was crazy to think I could do something different. But you know what kept me going?" Frank shook his head, still skeptical. "Hope," Elon said simply. "Hope that things could get better. Hope that I could make a difference." Frank snorted, his skepticism returning. "Hope doesn't pay the bills." "No," Elon agreed. "But it's the first step. And sometimes it's all you need to keep moving forward." Before Frank could respond, the cafe door swung open again. This time, the manager didn't come alone. He was flanked by a tall, sharply dressed man who exuded an air of authority. The new arrival's piercing gaze swept over the scene, landing on Elon with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Mr. Musk," the man said, his tone polite but firm. "I'm James Preston, the property manager for this block. I've been informed there's an issue here." Elon straightened, his expression unreadable. "Is that so?" "Yes," Preston said, glancing briefly at Frank before returning his attention to Elon. "We've had multiple complaints about loitering in this area. It's disruptive to the businesses and the community." Frank bristled at the thinly veiled accusation, but Elon spoke before he could. "And how do you define loitering?" Preston hesitated, clearly not expecting the question. "Well, it's because as far as I can tell," Elon continued, his tone sharp, "the only disruption here is the way people like you treat those less fortunate." Preston's eyes narrowed slightly, his professional demeanor slipping just enough to reveal his annoyance. "With all due respect, Mr. Musk, this isn't about morality. It's about maintaining order." "And whose order is that?" Elon countered, his voice rising slightly. "The kind that prioritizes profits over people? The kind that dehumanizes anyone who doesn't fit into your neat little definition of success." The small crowd that had begun to gather earlier had returned, drawn by the escalating confrontation. Murmurs rippled through the group as they watched the exchange unfold. Preston's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "I'm simply enforcing the rules." Elon took a step closer, his presence towering despite his calm tone. "Rules aren't inherently just," he said. "And enforcing unjust rules doesn't make you righteous. It makes you complicit." Preston's face flushed, and for a moment, he looked like he might argue. But before he could, Elon reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few quick taps, he turned the screen toward Preston, who paled as he read whatever was displayed. "What is this?" Preston demanded, his voice shaking slightly. It's a donation, Elon said coolly, to a local homeless shelter. Enough to provide housing and support for 100 people for the next year. The crowd gasped, the murmurs growing louder. Preston's eyes darted around nervously, clearly aware that he was losing control of the situation. And here's the kicker, Elon added, his gaze locking onto Preston. I'm also purchasing this building. The manager, who had been lurking in the background, looked like he was about to faint. You can't be serious, he sputtered. Oh, I'm very serious, Elon said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Starting tomorrow, this space will no longer be a cafe. It'll be a community center. A place where people like Frank can find support instead of judgment. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing down the street. Frank stared at Elon, his mind racing. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Felt like a dream, too good to be true. Preston and the manager exchanged panicked glances before hurriedly retreating, their protests drowned out by the cheers of the crowd. Frank watched them go, a small, incredulous smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Why are you doing this? He asked Elon again, his voice trembling. Elon turned to him, his expression softening. Because I can, he said simply, and because I should. Frank felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He wasn't used to feeling this way, grateful, hopeful, seen. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The crowd's cheers lingered in the air as Preston and the cafe manager stumbled back into the building, their confidence shattered. Frank stood frozen, staring at Elon as if he couldn't fully grasp what had just happened. Around them, people began to approach cautiously, their murmurs turning into praise and awe for Elon's bold stand. Inside the cafe, Preston and the manager exchanged frantic whispers, their faces pale. For years, the cafe had operated under Preston's property management rules, exploiting loopholes and hiking rents while turning a blind eye to ethical issues. The manager's smug sense of authority had grown unchecked, leaving him unprepared for the public humiliation Elon had just dealt him. Preston was worse off, knowing his entire livelihood depended on properties like this. And now, he had not only lost control but also been exposed in front of a crowd, some of whom were filming every word with their phones. Preston peered out the window and saw Elon talking to Frank. Something about Elon's calm demeanor as he comforted the homeless man made his blood boil. Preston was used to wielding control, whether through paperwork or intimidation, and now it felt like he had none. We can't let this happen, Preston hissed to the manager. He's just grandstanding. He'll forget about all of this by morning. These billionaires love their stunts, but they don't follow through. The manager nodded furiously, grasping for a semblance of control. You're right. This is temporary. We just need to weather the storm. Preston's mind raced. He could already feel the cracks forming in his carefully cultivated reputation. News of this incident was likely spreading online. If Elon truly followed through and turned the cafe into a community center, Preston would lose more than just rent from this one property. He'd lose credibility across all his other ventures. But outside, the momentum was shifting. Elon stepped closer to Frank, handing him a phone. Here, he said, call this number tomorrow. It's a housing initiative I started a few years ago. They'll help you get on your feet. Frank took the phone with trembling hands. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Elon replied, smiling. Just take the opportunity when it comes. As the crowd around them clapped and cheered again, Preston couldn't take it anymore. He stormed outside, his face red with frustration. This is outrageous, he bellowed, drawing everyone's attention. You can't just come in here and make demands like you own the place. Elon turned to him, his calm gaze cutting through Preston's fury. I don't need to make demands, he said evenly. I already own it. The crowd gasped, and Preston visibly flinched. What are you talking about? He sputtered. Check your email, Elon said, pulling out his phone and showing Preston a confirmation screen. The purchase was finalized 20 minutes ago. It's no longer your property to manage. Preston stared at the screen, his face draining of color. The crowd erupted into laughter and applause, and even Frank couldn't suppress a grin. Preston had spent years building his empire on the backs of others, using his position to exploit those with no voice. Now, in a single night, it was crumbling beneath him. "You can't do this," Preston stammered. "There are contracts, agreements. There are also ways to do things ethically," Elon said, his tone sharp. "You might want to look into that." The cafe manager stepped outside, his expression a mix of panic and anger. "What about me?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "This is my livelihood. You can't just ruin it." Elon turned to him, his gaze unwavering. "You ruined it yourself when you chose profit over people." The manager looked like he wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he slumped against the doorframe, his bravado completely deflated. Around him, the crowd whispered and filmed, their judgment palpable. Preston clenched his fists, his pride refusing to let him accept defeat. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he snapped at Elon. "This is just a publicity stunt. You'll move on to the next thing, and this place will go under because you don't know how to run it." Elon smiled faintly. "You're right about one thing, I won't be running it. But I've already appointed someone who will." Preston blinked, confused. "What?" Elon gestured to Frank, who froze in place. "Frank here will oversee the transition to the community center," Elon said. "He knows this neighborhood better than anyone, and he understands what it means to struggle. He's the perfect person to lead this." Frank's eyes widened. "Me? But I'm not qualified for." "You're more qualified than anyone else," Elon interrupted gently. "You've lived it, and you care." The crowd erupted into cheers again, their energy infectious. Frank looked around, his heart pounding. For so long, he had been invisible, a forgotten man on the margins of society. Now, he was being given a chance to matter, to make a difference. Preston and the manager exchanged helpless glances, their last shreds of control slipping away. For years, they had operated with impunity, their greed unchecked. But tonight, they were being held accountable, not just by Elon, but by the community they had neglected. As the crowd began to disperse, some approached Frank to shake his hand or pat him on the back. Others lingered to thank Elon for his generosity. Preston and the manager, meanwhile, slinked away into the night, their reputations in tatters. Frank turned to Elon, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Elon said with a smile. "Just pay it forward when you can." Frank nodded, a sense of purpose blooming within him. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a future. As Elon walked away, the crowd's cheers followed him. Preston and the manager might have lost their grip on this corner of the city, but for Frank and others like him, it was just the beginning of something new. As the night wore on and the crowd finally began to disperse, Frank found himself standing in front of the cafe-turned-community center, a place that symbolized not just a fresh start for him, but for so many others who had felt abandoned by society. The once proud cafe manager and Preston, the property manager, were nowhere to be seen. Their downfall was complete, not through cruelty or revenge, but through the powerful act of justice served in the form of compassion and accountability. Inside, Frank lingered near the counter, running his fingers across the surface. The space was still the same, but the energy felt completely transformed. Tomorrow, it would open its doors to a new purpose, a haven for the homeless, a hub for those looking to rebuild their lives. For the first time in years, Frank wasn't invisible. He was now a symbol of resilience and hope for others. Elon's words still echoed in his mind. Pay it forward. Frank resolved to do just that. He knew he couldn't change the world overnight, but if he could help even one person feel seen, it would be worth it. What you've just seen is more than a story about one man's generosity. It's a wake-up call. How often do we overlook people like Frank? How often do we judge those in need without understanding their struggles? This story reminds us that true strength doesn't come from wealth or power. It comes from the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's not the easy thing to do. Elon Musk didn't just swoop in as a billionaire savior. He demonstrated what it means to use privilege responsibly, turning a moment of conflict into a transformative act of justice. But this story isn't just about him. It's about the Franks of the world, the people we pass by every day without a second glance, whose lives could change with a small act of kindness. The downfall of Preston and the cafe manager teaches us an important lesson. Greed and exploitation can only take you so far. In the end, it's empathy, accountability, and community that truly matter. They thought they could get away with exploiting the vulnerable, but they were reminded, in no uncertain terms, that their actions have consequences. To all of you watching, take a moment to think about what you can do in your own lives to make a difference. You don't have to be a billionaire to change someone's world. Maybe it's a meal for someone in need, a kind word to a stranger, or simply taking the time to listen. Small actions ripple outward, creating waves of change. And for those of you who might feel like Frank, forgotten, unseen, struggling to make it to tomorrow, know this: you are not alone. There is always hope, and there are people who care. Sometimes the most unlikely moments can lead to a turning point. Keep holding on. Let this story inspire you to act, to challenge the injustices around you, and to believe in the power of compassion. And if this video moved you, consider sharing it. Spread the message that everyone deserves dignity, and no one should feel invisible. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Who knows? Your story or your insight might inspire someone else to take action. Together, we can create a world where kindness and justice prevail. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.